Okay. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Gary Prevost. I'm the coordinator of the Global Awareness Lecture Series, professor in the Department of Political Science and Latino Latin American Studies. Tonight's program actually is the third program in our combined efforts between LLAS and Global Awareness this semester to focus on the United States and the Latin American region. The final program will be on Tuesday night, November the 11th, where the focus will be Guatemala and a film about human rights issues there and how those came to be connected in some way to the United States. That'll be our final program, and you'll get some information on that. I'm especially pleased tonight to introduce my longtime friend and collaborator, Carlos Oliva Campos, who is professor of history in the Department of History at the University of Havana. Carlos and I have known each other for almost 20 years, and for the last 15 years, we have been part of a collaborative research effort of professors from Cuba, the United States, and across the rest of Latin America, including our Brazilian colleagues. And during that time period, we have studied and written about many different aspects of inter-American affairs, but with particular emphasis on the efforts that first were underway from the United States for the creation of a free trade area of the Americas that did not come to pass, and then since then a set of integrative projects that have come more from the Latin Americans themselves. Carlos and I are going to, in fact, to be together within the next 2 weeks at our annual gathering of these scholars in Puebla, in Mexico. So tonight, Carlos is going to be presenting really some of the ideas that we developed in a book that was published in 2011, where Carlos and myself both made contributions in addition to some of our colleagues, where the focus was Cuba and its relations with the entire hemisphere, with particular emphasis on its relationship with the rest of Latin America, but very much in the spirit of this series, in the context of both Cuban-United States relations and United States relations with the rest of the hemisphere. The context of Cuba and Latin America, which he's going to talk to you about, and he's going to, in a sense, briefly cover the whole time from the Cuban Revolution of 1959 up to all the way up to the recent time. But the main theme of this will be that Cuba, as a revolutionary country which challenged the status quo across Latin America, as my students who are here tonight from my Latin American politics course, a fundamental challenge to the group that Galeano calls the Commission Bourgeoisie of Latin America, basically saying to them, your days are numbered. There's going to be revolution in the hemisphere. And that resulted in Cuba generally not having much in the way of diplomatic relations in Latin America, since on one level it was saying to those leaders, we're going to support revolutionaries in your countries who will seek to bring you down. Well, that particular phase did not result in many revolutionary changes in Latin America. And so, as Carlos will talk about, a change began where Cuba, some 30 years ago, halfway into its revolutionary period, began to reassess its relationship with the rest of Latin America and find a way to reintegrate and to make better relations within Latin America. And as Carlos will discuss tonight, that was made very much possible in the last 15 years by dramatic changes that were occurring in the political realm in Latin America that had traditionally, before the mid-'80s, dominated by military governments that, of course, were hostile to Cuba, but then later dominated by governments that, while democratic, represented conservative forces that were not really in Cuba's corner. But then, in the last 15 years, a dramatic shift to the political left in Latin America, where today not only is the entire region dominated by political democracies, but those elections are won by parties of the left. There just was, as some of you know, on Sunday, a very important election in the most important country in Latin America, Brazil, where Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party, socialist president, won a fourth consecutive term now that will cover a total of 16 years of socialists in power in Brazil. And this changed fundamentally what was possible for Cuba within the Western Hemisphere, so that it came full circle from the early 60s, immediately after the revolution, when Cuba not only had no relations with the United States, no diplomatic relations with the U.S., those were broken and an embargo put in place, but virtually none within the hemisphere. Mexico was the only Latin American country with which diplomatic relations were maintained. But that would come, and I'll finish my introduction now, that would come full circle in 2009, 5 years ago, when a left candidate, Mauricio Funes, former guerrilla leader, supported by the Cubans as a guerrilla leader, came to the presidency by election of a close American ally, El Salvador. And when El Salvador normalized relations with Cuba after that election, it was full circle. Cuba then had full diplomatic relations with every country in the hemisphere without, which one, of course? The United States. So that's the kind of fundamental change that he's going to talk about. I don't think he's going to specifically during his talk say much about U.S.-Cuban relations, which could be undergoing change as the result of that fundamental change. But he's definitely going to be open during the question and answer period. If you wish to ask questions about that, he will gladly entertain them. So with no further introduction, please welcome back for his third visit to St. John's, St. Ben's, over the past decade plus, Carlos Oliva Campos. Carlos.
Thank you very much, Gary, and everybody here for your presence. I want to open my presentation giving a few general ideas of the Cuban Revolution in front of the region, in front of Latin America and the Caribbean. Let's move to another side, to the very complicated conflict, bilateral conflict between Cuba and the United States. The Cuban Revolution, I think, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in January 1959 received the benefits of a very special international circumstances. We can mention, for example, the process of decolonization in Asia and Africa, a process of economic recovery from Europe and saying goodbye to Marshall Plan, the open door to explore the space for the Soviet Union. At the beginning of the 60s, they sent all the family, Yuri Gagarin, a woman, and even a dog. The process of to get more close levels of identity in terms of nuclear weapons between Soviet Union and United States too. It was during these years, and the results of a revolution in Cuba that was a reaction against a very bloody dictatorships as Batista, but with a regional impact in other bloody dictatorships like Dominican Republic, in the case of Rafael Leónidas Trujillo. So it was all these circumstances, the idea of the rebels with their beers originated immediate solidarity from many people in all the hemisphere. And we must talk even about the impacts in culture, in the music. For example, the open of a new perspective of singers in Cuba, Silvio Rodríguez, Pablo Milanés, the so-called new Cuban singer. In Latin America, Mercedes Sosa, Daniel Biglietti, and many others that include the contents in their songs with political and social demands for this age. The impact in literature were deep. Galeano, Cortázar, Octavio Cortázar, and many others. Then this originated a first very positive reaction from peoples and even from governments in the region that included decided to invite Fidel. Fidel Castro was in Venezuela, was in Brazil. El Che Guevara was received in Buenos Aires for Arturo Frondizi, the former president of Argentina. But unfortunately, and so quickly after the first visit from Fidel to Washington, and the famous and very contradictory interview with the former Vice President Richard Nixon, the situation on Cuba moved toward others roots. I was remembering in the morning that will be following the statement of the former Cuban ambassador in the United Nations, Carlos Lechuga. He said Fidel never declared that he was communist in that moment. It was Richard Nixon who said he's definitely a communist. And well, we know very well the history. In terms of Latin America, we start to watch a negative reaction for these same governments and others that receive at the beginning with positive signals to the Cuban Revolution, and through the OAS, the Organization of American States, were the first confrontations with Cuba up to the moment, finally in 1964, in which Cuba was really isolated in the region, considering just two exceptions, but with in specific terms. Canada, just defending an official relation but without any linkage and any contact, and Mexico, with low-profile relations and trying to move its neighborhood with United States and trying to avoid the presence of support to Mexican guerrillas, to a linkage with the leftist movements in Mexico and party. And that was the ways of these relations until 1968, when President Luis Echeverría Álvarez opened a new moment for the bilateral relationships between Mexico and Cuba that have moved toward the same roots till 2000, with a change of a party in the power in Mexico, the substitution of the Institutional Revolutionary Party for PAN, the right party in Mexico. If we analyze the 60s, that it is a first moment of the relationships between Cuba and Latin America, we must divide the official conflict from Cuba with the region, of Cuba with the region, and the unofficial, or it's better to say the people-to-people relationships and all the solidarity that move to support the Cuban Revolution in the majority of the countries of these Latin American and Caribbean countries of this hemisphere. The 70s was a very interesting period because at the same moment there were the coincidence of two specific processes. One, internally at the OAS, and the discussion, the debate to eliminate the prohibition of Organization of American States, to eliminate the prohibition of the clause of ideological pluralism. And the other is to permit to each country in the region to analyze if they are capable to normalize or to reestablish relationships with Cuba. And this is a moment very important for the Caribbean countries too, mainly the British Caribbean, because of they ended the process of decolonization, and four very important leaders of the Caribbean, British Caribbean in that moment: Michael Manley in Jamaica, Forrest Burhan in Guyana, Eric Williams in Trinidad and Tobago, and Errol Brown in Barbados, decided to move and a re-encounter with Cuba, very important. So Cuba began to receive positive signals from the Caribbean, this group of the Caribbean community, and from other countries in the region. But unfortunately, and we must say that till the open of the so-called post-Cold War era, the relationships between Cuba and the region were always moving in a waving approach and isolation. The Central American crisis, I'm talking about all the guerrilla movements, well, the victory of Sandinistas in Nicaragua in 1979, the guerrilla movements in El Salvador, in Guatemala, originated, of course, a reaction of United States and all the allies in the region against Cuba. And we have the events of Grenada, the small island in the Caribbean, October 1983, in which where Cuban presence in the moment of U.S. military intervention, they fight a group of Cuban military and civilian advisors and constructors that were there building a new airport, and I'm not ingenious, an airport with the support with Cuba, and in a moment in which the alliance between Cuba and the Soviet Union were too strong, was really received from the U.S. government as a real menace for national security, and the possibility of internal disorders in the leaderships of the government of this island facilitated the U.S. intervention and this confrontation, and finally the end or a cut of the relationships between Cuba and the British Caribbean for a short period of time, because in 1990 they tried again to reestablish relation, to reopen a very close linkage that maintained up to now. In terms of Latin America, and this I want to develop now ideas about three processes that I consider fundamentals in order to support the idea that the current reinsertion of Cuba is really sustainable. The first of this process, and they were together at the same period of time, moving from the 80s till up to now, more or less to the beginning of the 21st century. The first of all was something very important in my personal opinion for the region, that was the impact in ideological terms in the region and in the leftist movements and parties in the region because of the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Socialist countries in Europe. Why? Because during a decades, the influence of Soviets, Stalinism, and even Maoism in all these sectors of the leftists in Latin America were really dangerous, because they live reaction using external perspective without a real focus of our own problems, and of course submitted to the East-West confrontation with between United States and the Soviet Union. So, because of the fall of the Wall of Berlin and all these European socialists, the leftist movements and parties in Latin America had to look for in our own roots, in our own history, to react even against many of communist parties that in the past and during all these Cold War years were at the end collaborators with dictators and military governments. Argentina is an example. Bolivia is other example. Segments of communists because of torture or because of other decisions, but it was a reality that the extreme leftist position were really an extreme, using terms of contemporary terms, real fundamentalism from a leftist perspective. Then the possibility to organize a new forum from all these leftist movements and parties in Latin America, the so-called Sao Paulo Forum in 1992, was something very important. And Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, Lula, and Fidel Castro were the figures in charge of organize and to try to move to the presence of many leaders from all the varieties of the left in the region. I think that it was important, for example, in terms of the future political coalitions that permit to Lula, that has been defeated for 3 times in the past, to won definitely a presidential election in 2002 in Brazil. And other example is Uruguay, that we are waiting for all the final details of the presidential elections last Sunday, because of this new movement in which participate sectors of left and right, like Brazil. Lula organized a coalition even with very important sectors from the high capital in the country. And that permit him to present, I think, it's possible to say, a new perspective of a social democracy. And I say that because the traditional social democracy in Brazil is headed by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the president that was finally defeated in 2000 by Lula. And now Fernando Henrique is supporting the candidate who was defeated by Dilma in these current elections last Sunday too in Brazil. So there are 2 models of social democracy, but the interesting is interesting in this case the item that Lula, with the support of these right wings, began to open new social programs very important for people in Brazil, and without any reference before. So he opened a new moment for Brazil with his perspective, like Nestor Kirchner in Argentina. Kirchner won in a second round and receiving the support of many people because of Carlos Saúl Menem, a former president and a person that moved the country to a very deep internal economic crisis. And then at the end, Kirchner was a politician not very knowledgeable, but received the support, and finally he can develop a kind of new neo-Peronism in comparison with the original project of Perón during the 40s and the 50s of the 20th century. Other example is Hugo Chavez. Chavez is a very particular example, not because he was a military, because Chavez, in the history of Latin America, we found other examples. Omar Torrijos in Panama, Juan Velasco Alvarado in Peru, for example, and it was very important at the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s. But Chavez was a man who recovered the figure of Bolivar and tried to combine. Even he changed the name of the republic, Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, tried to reorganize the society in order to move out the control of a very strong oligarchy who lived because of oil, of Venezuelan oil, and open a very important moment in terms of strategic relationships with Cuba and personally with Fidel Castro. I think this is very knowledge. The presence of in Venezuela of important groups of Cuban medical doctors, educators, training sport trainers, and other professionals that are working there. I can mention other examples of this new ideological scenario. Evo Morales, the first indigenous president, well, at least recognized in the 20th century. Benito Juarez was in Mexico, an indigenous president too, during the 19th century. But the question is that we do not forget that Bolivia has, unfortunately, the record of coup d'etat in the region, 159. And Evo Morales tried to move the internal situation to try to give real rights to this very important number of indigenous people. We are talking about the half, more or less, of the 55% of the population of Bolivia have indigenous origin. So, in this case of Evo Morales, it's very interesting because of he changed things that nothing thought would be possible, as to officialize the use of indigenous language, to try to give much more rights to this population, and of course originated a big confrontations with the right and the traditional oligarchy in this country. We can mention, and not because of the last one, but because it is other very particular example, the case of Rafael Correa. Correa is an economist. Correa was a universitarian professor from the elite in Quito, but in Ecuador, yes, but specifically in Quito, and but a very knowledge expert in terms of analysis and critical of neoliberalism. And he arrived to the government in a very complicated situation of this country that in political terms continues as a kind of divided country because of the reaction of a very important indigenous movements in Ecuador against all the governments. Why? Well, if you check and read the history of the last 20 years in the region, Ecuador was played the role of the many important events, including the indigenous movements and a former president, Lucio Gutierrez, a colonel who invited them to be part of the government at the beginning, but at the end they were used and definitely separated from Gutierrez, and the confrontation between white or civilian people and the indigenous are continuously, even in this moment with Correa, is one of the main problems he has to confront in his government in this country. This is, in general, the first process, an ideological process that, of course, facilitated a reinsertion of Cuba in the region. But we have an economic process that began during the 80s years because of the perception of the Cuban leadership, I'm talking about Fidel Castro in that moment, that something was wrong in the Soviet Union and something will happen that finally we show. What's it? So, the first was to try to reopen and recover relations with other countries in the region. And there was an event, an important event to facilitate this Cuban strategy, the Malvinas War of April-June 1982. Why? Because in that moment, Fidel Castro was the president of the non-aligned movement. We are talking about an important numerically movement in the world, and as a leadership that he had in that moment in the Third World. So it was very interesting to watch at the TV in Havana a person like Nicanor Costa Mendez arriving to Havana, the chancellor of the Argentinian military government of that moment, to have an interview with Fidel Castro. And of course, the solidarity developed by Cuba established links with many other countries to react because of the presence of the British fleet in the South Atlantic, and the real support of the U.S. government to its main strategic ally. Everybody know about this. At the end, later, here a year later, in 1983, it was happening the fall of the Argentinian military government and a reopen of democracy with Raúl Alfonsín, and began to react in other countries, in Brazil, in Bolivia, and in many others, and then a process of democratization was moving toward all the region. This is something very important because Fidel Castro was invited to many of these countries, tried to negotiate new economic relations. Please do not forget that we live during more than 30 years with all the relationships in the focus of Soviet Union and the rest of the Eastern European countries, the famous Comecon. And then when the Soviet Union fell, Cuba, the trade balance of Cuba that was in 1990 about $10,000 billion down to more than $1,500. It was really dramatic for us and directly for the Cuban population. I don't know if we can talk about this in your next class with the group. So it was very important because Cuba tried to open doors to their economy, tourism, and other economic and commercial trade links with the region. Even from Mexico was very important the presence of a person that I'm really sure that is now behind President Peña Nieto. I'm talking about former President Carlos Salinas de Gortari. Salinas de Gortari and Fidel Castro established a personal relationships, and was Salinas de Gortari the person who moved to Cuba, a very important businessman from Monterrey, from Mexico, to try to make private investments in the island for the first time during all the period of time of the Cuban Revolution. And well, up to the moment in 1996 that we approved the Helms-Burton bill in your Congress here, and the decision to prohibit all trade linkage with Cuba, and to punish all countries and enterprises who make any kind of business with Cuba. But definitely, till 1993, Cuba opened our country to a new reality. We began to see in Havana tourists from all over the world. After 1990, it was non-existent. Just well, the Russians in Cuba were not tourists, were part of the society because of massive presence in many things, and Bulgarians, Eastern Germans, and many others. So, but this began to show a new Cuba in terms of tourism, in terms of the possibility of foreign investors in many sectors, and well, a very important new movement to reinsert Cuban economy in the world in general, and in Latin America particularly. And the third, I'm not sure how is the time, the third process that I want to mention is a political process, and there is a very, very important item that moves all the region. It's the axis of regional integration. In the first moment, with the confrontation between important Latin American leaderships like Chavez, Lula, Kirchner, against the free trade area of America, that was definitely suspended in 2005. But originated not a solidarity, but a new and important changes in Latin American foreign policies in terms of to build new institutions, new multilateral institutions like UNASUR or CELAC, that is the Latin America and Caribbean perspective of a system or a subsystem from Latin America and the Caribbean without United States and Canada. So I think, and even in last January, Cuba finished a term of a year as president, temporary president of CELAC, in the person of the Cuban president Raúl Castro. In Havana, they received about 30 presidents and first ministers, prime ministers. So this was a very good example of how Cuba has been accepted in the regional community, and I think that I have give you, in general terms, how do I consider, or why do I consider that this moment of reinsertion of or a new presence of Cuba in the region are really sustainable and not in comparison with other moments in the past. Thank you very much.
Carlos, thank you very much for being precise in your presentation. It leaves good time for questions. Just a couple of announcements. First, the reading circle group, once this set of questions and answers is completed, and will probably take about 20 minutes in total for your questions. If you'd come up to the front for a brief session, and we'll be done with that session, I hope, by 9 o'clock. Just one announcement that many of you have seen, but an invitation. I am, this coming May term, going to be leading a 10-day study travel course in Cuba, which is permitted under narrow arrangements of U.S. law, whereby U.S. citizens can travel to Cuba for educational purposes. I've accepted a few students into the program, but we still do have places available in that program. I'm accepting applications through the OEA website now, and will continue to do so over the next several weeks. So if you are interested in that potential course in Cuba, please feel free to be in touch with me. One of the presentations that will happen at that course in Cuba will come from Carlos actually on a similar subject to that which he talked to you about tonight. So, with those two announcements, the floor is now open to any questions that you have.
The current relationships between China and Cuba?
In its relationship with Latin America.
Well, but are quite different.
Yes, but the context.
I will try to explain both. Okay. Well, first, Cuba. I used to say China is always China. We watch at the TV the recognition that China is a very good ally, that we have a very close relations with China, but if we do not pay to China in any of the business we have with them, they will punish us because they are Chinese. And considering the rest of Latin America,
What kinds of things? What is the nature of the relationship? What kinds of things does China provide?
no, business. For example, public transportation, buses, equipment, machinery from agriculture. That's in general. They are not present in foods. In spite of Vietnam, Vietnam used to deliver to export to Cuba new articles for foods.
Right, so in a sense, China in that regard has replaced some of the machinery and things that had in the previous times come from the Soviet Union.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you, Gary. And in referring to China-Latin American relationships, the main problem is that China is looking for here raw material. So China, and if you analyze the volume of the bilateral trade, for example, China with Mexico and China with Brazil, the three most important partners from China at the region are Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. But in all the cases, they look for raw materials and export to the region. There are new machinery, trains, and many other things, but with the quality we know have many of these products. With all the respect, but this is true. And then, well, that's the situation in general terms.
The future of Latin American Cuban relations, in other words, from this moment forward, what kinds of things do you expect?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, because of I talk about the very close the closer allies of Cuba in the region because of ALBA, but Cuba has
We should say that I don't think you had mentioned the term the Bolivarian alliance, the alliance that
yes.
links Cuba with Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and several Caribbean islands. That's a project of solidarity, of especially Cuban doctors and educators and technical people that work in those countries.
Okay, thank you, Gary. So, but Cuba are developed sustainable relationships with other countries with governments. For example, Colombia. Cuba now is facilitating the dialogue in Havana between the guerrillas, the Colombian guerrillas, and the Colombian government. Cuba has normal relations, for example, with Costa Rica. That's other country with several confrontings in the past. Well, in general, Cuba have maintained official relationships with all the countries in this hemisphere. The last one were in 2009, El Salvador and Costa Rica, as Gary explained in his introduction.
Could you talk just a little bit about the importance of the relationship with Brazil and specifically talk a little bit about the economic character of that relationship for the potential further development of Cuban economic programs?
Well, with Brazil, and mainly because of Lula, and because of the historical personal relationships between Fidel and Lula, in this moment, the bilateral trade between both countries is, from our levels, very important. Brazil is the third partner from Cuba in terms of trade. But Brazil support a very important projects in Cuba, like the port of Mariel in the north coast of the island, in the western of the island, with the idea to create a free zone, a free area, free trade area, and even to, I think, that to make signals to many American businessmen that are really interested in try to open doors with Cuba and negotiate and participate in the opportunities of business in the island. And please do not forget another linkage, the idea to create a new channel in Nicaragua. So, this, pardon? A new canal through Nicaragua, and considering the close relations between Nicaragua and Cuba, and new eventual strategies from ALBA, for example, with Venezuela, etc. So Brazil is participating in these new strategic projects in Cuba and with the impact in all of the region.
Just one other question in that, also in that vein, if you could just talk a little bit about the special importance of the Venezuela-Cuba relationship, both politically and economically.
Yes. If we analyze the relationships built by Fidel and Chavez between Cuba and Venezuela, if you look for in the bibliography, you will find many authors that use the term petrodólares or oil diplomacy or new dependence, external dependence of Cuba because of Venezuelan oil. We are living after the Soviet Union in oil terms, in energetic terms, because of Venezuela and the bilateral agreements signed by Fidel and Hugo Chavez. And in this moment, the first economic sector of Cuban economy are services through, for example, Cuban medical doctors. We have more than 55,000 medical doctors and paramedicals in general in more than 60 countries all over the world. And in Latin America, in many countries. In Brazil, there are more than 4,000 Cuban medical doctors in this moment.
Right, and I think it was implied by that, and the economic importance for Cuba for that is that becomes the basis on which Venezuela provides a certain amount of oil to Cuba in return for the services of those medical doctors. Because in the case of the Venezuelan revolutionary process, when it moved to the left and projected national health care system, basically many of the Venezuelan doctors connected to the old regime would have no part of that. They were not going to serve the poor, no way, no how, and some left the country. And so in the absence of 4,000 Cuban doctors, it would have been very hard for the Chavez government to provide the kind of dramatic change in social services that it has provided over the last 15 years and have become the dominant force in the country. Other questions for Carlos?
I was just kind of wondering, with the upcoming Summit of the Americas, if Cuba does attend that, do you think it's going to have any sort of what impact?
Let me, for the tape, his question is, the upcoming Summit of the Americas scheduled for Panama early next year, will Cuba attend the conference, and what implications can that have for the summits and for the United States?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's look for the crystal ball. Nobody knows really if Cuba be there or not. It is true. My question is, are Cuba really interested in this Summit of the Americas? If Cuba are participating now in CELAC, and Cuba have other roles, are moving other roles in the region? Of course, if the Cuban government receive real signals from United States, because Cuba are all in full contact with the rest of the hemisphere. But if they receive, I think, if they receive some signal from the U.S. government, would be very interesting and important to organize an interview or a meeting between both presidents. But I don't know. Let's wait and see.
Other questions?
maybe people, former or medical doctors. Yes, I suppose in Miami, there are a lot of Cuban medical doctors that decided to come to live here.
I think I actually have because of information issues, I have probably a much better
Okay.
answer to that question. In interesting ways, yes. Well, the question of Cuban doctors in the United States. Yes, there are some, and it's a very controversial program. As Carlos indicated, Cuba has 55,000 doctors that work overseas. Many of them working in some of the most underserved areas, whether it's Venezuela or throughout Latin America. In any objective way, this is a kind of Peace Corps on steroids kind of program that's had incredible health impacts around the world. This may shock you, but may not. The government of the United States officially considers this program to be human trafficking. And it consciously, through a program in the State Department, seeks to have these doctors desert to the United States, offers them financial incentives to leave their missions in the various countries that they're in. Inevitably, some of those offers do succeed. The Cuban government basically expects in any given year to lose maybe 2 to 3% of the doctors that they have trained who are Cubans abroad to come and wind up in the United States. So yes, there is such a thing. It has particularly the controversial nature of this program, I think, may become even more real in the coming days. Cuba is in the process of sending 451 doctors and medical personnel for the Ebola crisis in the West African countries. From any given government, it's the largest contribution of any country in the world. The United States has mainly some military people there building some hospitals, temporary hospitals, but it's not a major, robust United States involvement. The attention to this action resulted in the New York Times, in a rather extraordinary editorial a week ago, basically saying to Obama, you could learn from Cuba. Because the United States' response from the point of view of the New York Times to the crisis in West Africa is not adequate. But to use what Cuba was doing as a positive example, obviously, I'm not sure that editorial sat very well in the White House. Though Secretary Kerry did specifically single out his support for what the Cubans were doing there and said that the United States, with U.S. personnel there, would cooperate fully. But an interesting side of how the strangeness of U.S.-Cuban relations, the Cubans had no experience with Ebola. So they needed training in the last 2 weeks as they prepared to send their people. Who did the training? People from the Centers of Disease Control of Atlanta flew to Havana to provide that training, which is, again, another side of what I call the weirdness at times of U.S.-Cuban relations. There are certain things between the two countries which actually happen on a very normal basis. Whether you agree with it or not, the United States and Cuba cooperate very much on drug control programs in the Caribbean, for example, and cooperate very closely on hurricane monitoring in the region. The Cubans very much depend upon the National Weather Service in Miami to provide advance notice about the hurricanes, because the United States has far more sophisticated equipment and satellites in that regard. I'm sorry it's a little bit of a long answer, but it's a very important issue. The Latin American Medical School in Havana has trained thousands of people to be doctors from countries around the world. One of the special programs of that school is for United States citizens. It's a program of the Congressional Black Caucus to train primarily American students of color to be doctors in Cuba, with the understanding that they will come back to the United States and serve in underserved communities in Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and the like. And there have been, I think now, in the last 5 or 6 years, there have been at least 25 or 30 graduates from that program. So in that sense, Cuba is also sending medical doctors to the United States. I intervene because some of this information is actually probably better known in the United States than it is in Cuba. Other questions? Anyone want to have our last question, frame a question about United States-Cuban relations in the context of Cuba's changed relations with Latin America? Yes.
The 5?
Yeah, the question of the case of the Cuban
Okay.
Five. And it may be in the context right, of the case of the Cuban
Well,
Five and its issue and whether or not it can be normal.
This case of the 5 Cuban agents that were put in jail in 1998 is a national item from Cuba and move an international, continuous international campaigns of solidarity in United States, here in your country. We are always, of course, looking for the most important support, because it is here the necessity to try to change the mind and the perspective, just to look then as spies. There are many questions, very important questions. To whom were they spying? And what they are trying to avoid? And we have a long history of terrorism against the island. The last events were even in 1998 too, when a young man, an Italian tourist, died because of a bomb in a hotel in the center of Havana. And then, well, we know perfectly that this is a very complicated case, but we maintain the hope. We have 2 of them in the island. There are 3 in jail here, and we hope, maintain the hope that in one moment, in any moment, it would be impossible to ignore this item, and a process of negotiation open to try to look for a final solution for this case.
Yeah, just to add the final point, and then we'll end. The context also is that the United States also has a case. It's an interesting case. A man by the name of Alan Gross was working in Cuba on behalf of the United States Agency for International Development in a secret capacity to provide special electronic equipment to opponents of the Cuban government. A project that was in violation of Cuban law. He was arrested, sentenced to 15 years in prison, and he is in a Cuban jail. And so it's sort of been understood that behind the scenes, it's likely that there have been conversations between the 2 governments, but these are very confidential and secret matters, about a possibility of some interchange of these individuals. And if there were to be a decision in Washington, and that's the big decision, to actually move more toward normal relations with Cuba, it is likely that the case of both the remaining members of the Cuban Five who are in U.S. prisons, together with the case of Alan Gross, would likely have to be settled before there could be a further normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba. Well, I thank you very much for your attention and time. Please thank Carlos for his presence. Two things. If any of you individually have questions for Carlos, he'll be over here by the podium. And if my reading circle group could come up here and get around in a circle with a few chairs over here, we'll have a chat for a few minutes.